Welcome to Question Mark, the podcast, exploring the greatest story ever told with open minds and open hearts.
We light it up, we won't come down, and the sun can't stop us now. Watching it come true, it's taking over you. This is the greatest show, where it's covered in all the colored lights, and the runaways are on in the night. Impossible comes true, it's taking over you. This is the greatest show.
Hello and welcome to Question Mark, a fortnightly podcast about the greatest story ever told, Mark's Gospel. Whether this is your first episode you've listened to or you're a regular listener, you are very welcome here. My name's David Payne, and I'll be your host and guide on this, the 24th episode of our journey through this fascinating book, written a long time ago, but as relevant today as it was when it was written. We're so glad you've taken time to tune in, and I'm sure you're in for a treat today as I introduce our guests. Our special guest today is John Burnett. Steph has talked a lot about John in previous episodes and his insight into Mark's Gospel, so I'm really looking forward to what he has to say. But he also runs the St. Nicholas Africa Fund to support children's education in Africa. Do have a look at their website and maybe find out more about what they're doing. They've raised a staggering $250,000 in a decade to support the work. I'll let him say a bit more about himself and his relationship with Mark's Gospel, and indeed with Stephen Smart, who probably needs no introduction. However, in case you don't know Stephen, he's currently preparing to perform I Am Mark all around the country in a town near you, including at the Edinburgh Fringe in August. This is how we believe the gospel would have been experienced in the 1st century AD, and his audiences love seeing and hearing the message in this way. We'll let the guest go first. So, John, we're delighted to have you with us. Would you like to start by saying a bit more about yourself and how you know Stephen, and why are you so interested in Mark's Gospel?
Well, that's a little hard to say. First of all, I don't like to talk about myself. So I have degrees in Old Testament and Buddhism, of all things. But I was also the dean of a couple of seminaries in Kampala, Uganda, and Johannesburg, South Africa. And it was in teaching Mark there that I realized I really didn't understand what this book was about. It just looked like a pile of paragraphs to me, and nobody writes a book like that. So what is Mark talking about? You know? So that was the beginning of a long period of studying Mark rather exclusively, and so I've been basically doing that since 2007, I guess. So I've learned something about Mark.
And how did you come to know Stephen? What's your connection?
Well, I have this website called gospelofmarkworkshop.com, and somebody found that and wrote to me and wanted to take my course. So he's been taking my course. He's from Australia, and I guess he knew about Stephen, and he got in touch with Stephen and said, "You need to get in touch with this guy." So Stephen got in touch with me. I didn't know Stephen, so.
And I think we're going to be finding
out
a bit more about the course in just a moment. We're going to be finding out a bit more about the course in just a moment, experiencing it maybe. So Stephen, why did you want to, I think we know now, but why did you want to invite him on the show, and what's your relationship with him?
I mean, I thought I knew a lot about Mark's Gospel, but since having lessons with John, I have to say that so much has been revealed that I had absolutely no idea about, or very little idea. And it's far, far richer, as far as I can see now, than I've ever thought possible. And not only that, it's not just an intellectual enjoyment that's at stake. It's actually the message that Mark is trying to convey that has huge implications for all sorts of things. And it's not just for the 1st century either. It's for life in general, the 21st century as well. And I just find it amazing to be able to tackle the Gospels in the way we've been doing, looking a lot at the Greek, looking a lot at references to the Old Testament, thinking about a lot of it in terms of its literary content, thinking about the structure and the organization. It's clearly, as I thought it was, but even more so now, it's clearly a work of some sophistication, despite the fact, as John often tells me, it's written in bad Greek. It's actually a piece that has been fine-tuned and crafted over many years, it seems. Not, as I thought when I first read it, many, many years ago, simply a collection of stories from eyewitnesses. I'm sure it is based on eyewitness accounts, but nevertheless, there's something else going on here. There's a theological mind at work, and that's what's incredibly stimulating. So, yeah.
Well, I'm really looking forward to hearing more about your thoughts about this intriguing passage. And if you are listening and would like to join in and share your thoughts about the passage on social media, especially on the I Am Mark Community Facebook page, then we'll tell you a bit more about doing that later on. Welcome, both of you. And here is today's passage from Mark's Gospel, which is going to be read to us by Lucy Warner, a good friend of the show. Over to you, Lucy.
Mark chapter 6, verses 14 to 29, New International Version, John the Baptist beheaded. King Herod heard about this, for Jesus' name had become well known. Some were saying, John the Baptist has been raised from the dead, and that is why miraculous powers are at work in him. Others said, he is Elijah. And still others claimed, he is a prophet, like one of the prophets of long ago. But when Herod heard this, he said, John, whom I beheaded, has been raised from the dead. For Herod himself had given orders to have John arrested, and he had him bound and put in prison. He did this because of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, whom he had married. For John had been saying to Herod, it is not lawful for you to have your brother's wife. So Herodias nursed a grudge against John and wanted to kill him. But she was not able to, because Herod feared John and protected him, knowing him to be a righteous and holy man. When Herod heard John, he was greatly puzzled, yet he liked to listen to him. Finally, the opportune time came. On his birthday, Herod gave a banquet for his high officials and military commanders and the leading men of Galilee. When the daughter of Herodias came in and danced, she pleased Herod and his dinner guests. The king said to the girl, ask me for anything you want, and I'll give it to you. And he promised her with an oath, whatever you ask, I will give you, up to half my kingdom. She went out and said to her mother, what shall I ask for? The head of John the Baptist, she answered. At once the girl hurried in to the king with the request. I want you to give me right now the head of John the Baptist on a platter. The king was greatly distressed, but because of his oaths and his dinner guests, he did not want to refuse her. So he immediately sent an executioner with orders to bring John's head. The man went, beheaded John in the prison, and brought back his head on a platter. He presented it to the girl, and she gave it to her mother. On hearing of this, John's disciples came and took his body and laid it in a tomb.
Well, thank you, Lucy. And now it's over to John. I think you're going to get a taste of the Gospel of Mark workshop.com with some interruptions, questions, and so on from Steph and me. But over to you, John.
Okay, well, thank you very much for inviting me. This was all completely a surprise. I never expected to hear from someone like Stephen and to meet somebody who knew the gospel so well as he does. And it's really a pleasure to talk with somebody who I can hum a few bars and he can pick up the whole song. So it's a great thing. Anyway, okay. So I guess today we're going to talk about the beheading of John the Baptist. And the first thing I think that is necessary to get when we're looking at Mark is to get a sense of where in the story, the episode we're looking at is positioned. And so to get the structure of Mark's gospel, we have Jesus visits his hometown and experiences rejection there. So he sends the disciples out he goes around the villages of Galilee in a circle teaching. And then after that, Mark has the sending and the return of the 12. And in the middle of that story, of that episode, he sandwiches in the story of, first of all, of the various theories that people have about Jesus, that he's Elijah, that he's John the Baptist, that he's one of the prophets, and of course Herod's theory that that Jesus is John the Baptist risen from the dead. And then this is the opportunity to talk about the beheading of John the Baptist, because why is John in fact dead? Then when we get to the end of the story of John the Baptist's death, the 12 return, and then they take a boat journey to a desert place, and then there's a big crowd there, and Jesus heals them and feeds the 5,000. So it's good, I think, it's a lot of times to look at how the different evangelists handle the same material, because this will highlight what Mark is doing in particular. Matthew puts the story of Herod's theory about Jesus, that Jesus is John risen from the dead, right after his visit to the hometown. And he doesn't mention the sending of the 12 first at all. Herod hears of Jesus' fame and says to his retainers, "This is John the Baptist. He's been raised up from the dead, and because of this, the powers are at work at him. At work in him." And there's no discussion of the other opinions about Elijah or anything like that. Herod simply says what his theory is. And then Matthew's account of John the Baptist's beheading is rather shorter and flatter. And among other things, he says that Herod imprisoned John the Baptist because he's afraid of John the Baptist. Matthew doesn't mention Herodias and her hatred and all that stuff really at all. Doesn't mention much about Herodias. After John is beheaded, John's disciples come, they bury John's corpse, and they go back to Jesus. They return and tell Jesus about it. And then Jesus withdraws alone to a desert place where he finds the big crowd and feeds the 5,000 and so forth. So there's actually the disciples are not part of the story at all. The beheading of John the Baptist is part of a sequence of stories about Jesus. And so it's very much embedded in this context of Jesus. Now, Luke reduces Mark's tale of John's beheading to just a couple of allusions. Herod, first of all, at the end of his discussion of John the Baptist and his mission, or his teaching right before Jesus' baptism, he says, Herod the Tetrarch, who had been reproved by John because of Herodias, his brother's wife, and because of all the evil things that Herod had done, added this to them all, that he locked up John in prison. He concludes his account of John and then moves on to Jesus' baptism. Notice how in Mark puts Jesus' baptism in the middle of a discussion of John. First of all, John's coming and what he's doing. Then he baptizes Jesus, and then he says that John is handed over, and then Jesus launches his career. It's sort of similar to the way that he puts down the story of John in the middle of the story of the sending of the disciples here. So in Luke, all there is about John's beheading is Herod says, John I beheaded, but who is this I'm hearing all this stuff about? And he wants to see Jesus. At the end of the gospel, as you know, Pilate sends Jesus to Herod. Herod kind of laughs at him, realizes that he's no one to take seriously, and sends him back. And that's kind of all there is about the beheading of John in Luke's gospel. Now, so we can contrast this with Mark. Mark embeds the beheading of John inside the story of the sending of the apostles. So a lot of people say, well, the beheading of John and Mark, has so much to do with Jesus. Well, I don't really see that. The beheading of John in Mark's gospel is really kind of about the apostles, and we'll see that in other ways. And so Mark reports that the 12 went out proclaiming that people should repent, casting out demons and healing people. And Herod heard of Jesus because of their activities. And 12 are making his name known, and as a result, people had different opinions about him. Some thought it was John the Baptist raised from the dead. Because of this, the power was working in him, and others thought that he was Elijah or a prophet, like one of the prophets of old. But Herod's kind of an occultist. He has his own religious theories, and he says, "Well, this is John the Baptist risen from the dead." And then that leads to the discussion of the beheading itself. Well, notice that Mark has this kind of extended story about Jesus' identity. Is he Elijah? Is he John the Baptist? Is he one of the prophets? And of course, we know already from even chapter 1, verse 1, that these are all the wrong answers. The same answers will come up again at the end of chapter 8, when he asks the disciples, and then he finally says, "But who do you say I am?" And they say, "Well, you're the Messiah." And we've known that since chapter 1, verse 1, the beginning of the good news of Jesus, the Messiah, God's Son. But then it turns out strangely, as chapter 8 comes to a close, that's actually not quite a good answer. And Jesus tells them not to talk about it. And Jesus then later on in chapter 12 will kind of repudiate the title of Messiah when he gets into talking about, how can the Messiah be David's son, and so forth. So Messiah is maybe not an exactly adequate way to think of Jesus. And there are other things there. Well, okay, Mark doesn't go into all of that in great detail. What he does is launch into John the Baptist's death. Now, for Mark, Herod killed John reluctantly, partly because of Herodias's hatred and manipulation, and partly also because of his own stupidity and lust. In the end, John's disciples come and bury John's corpse, but they don't report to Jesus, as in Matthew. They just kind of disappear from the story. And the people that come back to Jesus and report to Jesus at the end of that, those are the disciples. That's the end of that thing, that the bread of the sandwich into which Mark has inserted the story of the beheading. And the 12 return and grandly announce all that they have done and taught. We're a little bit disturbed by that because, first of all, they're making this grand announcement about themselves.
Yeah.
And Jesus didn't actually authorize them to teach. He authorized them to heal and to cast out demons and to proclaim, but not to teach. And so,
John, we talked about that in the podcast last week, and was suggesting that this was just a summary of what Jesus told them to do, and actually they were doing what they'd seen the master doing. Would you disagree with that?
Because Mark does have Jesus teaching exactly right before he sends out the 12. And so it's a little bit jarring that he has them only proclaiming and healing and casting out demons, but not teaching. And they come back and they say what they were teaching. They say they were teaching.
Yeah.
So leaves a question. At this point, Mark isn't really talking about the failure of the disciples. That's going to become a big theme in the next big section of Mark. But it's just a little bomb under the bridge that he's left there, and it's ticking. Okay, so we talked about Luke and so forth. Just to notice that, let's get that part. Okay, we should also compare Mark's account of John's beheading to Josephus, because Josephus didn't have a dog in the fight. He's not interested in theology. He's just reporting for the Romans sort of what happened in the Jewish war. And he mentions that John the Baptist did exist and had a large following, and that he was kind of a troublesome prophet who spent his last days in prison until Herod Antipas had him put to death. And that's about as far as Mark's gospel and what we know for sure about history actually fit together. We know, of course, that if we've been reading Mark very carefully up to this point, we know that Mark's gospel, Mark does not intend to actually write a history of Jesus. That, as I've said, Stephen likes this, it's a poem of Jesus. And history, for example, doesn't happen in neat groups of 5 episodes plus 5 episodes, and 4 episodes plus 4 episodes, and 3 episodes with a pivot and 3 episodes like we have in Mark's gospel. So Mark is obviously shaping his material and so forth. And we see this really, really clearly in this story of John the Baptist. For example, Mark starts off by saying King Herod heard of what Jesus was doing. Well, Herod wasn't a king. His father was a king, but if Herod the Great, he was a king. But when he died, the Romans divided his kingdom into 4 parts, appointed 4 of his sons as tetrarchs, and that was their only title. The Romans didn't concede to any of those sons the title of king. And you'll notice that Matthew and Luke both correct Mark in this respect. They call him the tetrarch consistently. Mark isn't doing something wrong. Mark is telling a particular kind of story, a midrash, as it would be called in Hebrew. And so he needs Herod to be a king for the purposes of his story. And but that's just a point that we begin to see that Mark's story is not about history. It's about Jesus and about the kingdom of God, or the reign of God, as I prefer to say. Okay. King is actually an important word for Mark. This is the first time he uses it, but he will use it 12 times. I'm convinced, by the way, that there's some kind of numerical code going on in Mark, because keywords are so often he uses them seemingly a symbolic number of times. And so here we have king is used 12 times. The first 6 times are about confrontations with worldly kings, and they're never good. 5 of them are in this chapter, and then there's another one in chapter 13. And then the last 6 times are all in chapter 15, and they're all about Jesus. So Mark is clearly making a contrast or comparison between the kingdom or the kingship in this world and kingship and the kingship of Jesus. So this is the beginning of that arc, the arc in Mark. Mark has a lot of arcs, okay, and so forth. So, okay, moving to the story of the beheading, families like Herod's, big and poor families like that would throw birthday parties. To which they invited prominent guests, including military officers. But there's some problems here. Mark mentions that the guests at the party were the prominent men of Galilee. So that makes us think that this whole affair is taking place probably in Tiberias, which is Herod's capital. It's just kind of within sight of Capharnaum. But it's there. But the problem is that Josephus tells us that John the Baptist was arrested and imprisoned. He was arrested in the south and was imprisoned in Herod's fortress at Machaerus, which is considerably farther south. It's actually where John was active, and but it's sort of the lower end of the Perea, the other side of the Jordan, the east side of the Jordan. And it's about 3 days away from Galilee. Since Josephus has no theological interest in any of this and just mentions it kind of more or less in passing, we tend to believe that Josephus would be right. But if that's the case, then why does John say that this is all taking place in Galilee? Or why does he imply that? Well, part of the organization of Mark's gospel, not the only one, but part of it is that he organizes it by geography, and he's not going to get to the lower end of the Perea until later, and so it would just simply disturb his organization if he located the party down south. Jesus doesn't go south until the next section, and it takes him a while to get there. But there's also, the fact is, Mark tells us that Herod gave this banquet for the princes of the court, the tribunes, and the leading men of Galilee. Well, Herod was a tetrarch. He would not have had tribunes, heliarchy, who are commanders of 1,000. There are only about 5,000 in a legion, so there's only 5 of these guys in a whole legion, and he wouldn't have had men of this stature under him. So not only that we know that Palestine was kind of in a period of a good deal of social unrest at the time. Machaerus is about 3 days' journey away from Galilee. Would it have been reasonable that these top generals would have journeyed for 6 days, 3 there and 3 back, plus a day or 2 for the party in between during a time of social unrest? So that seems unlikely. So why is Mark talking about all of these sort of top level generals and other big people in his story? Well, one of the backgrounds, if we compare it, one of the background sources for Mark's story is the book of Esther. And we find that several ancient rabbinical commentaries present the banquet given by Ahasuerus as a birthday banquet. And the list of Herod's guests seems to have Ahasuerus's banquet in mind, the one in Esther. The expression for Herod's princes, Megastanes, is a normal rendering in the Septuagint for the Hebrew word sarim, and that's the term that appears at the head of the list in Esther 1.3.
Can we, John, could you explain for the listeners the Septuagint, what that is, because some may not have come across that before?
Oh, okay. The Septuagint is the translation of the Hebrew scriptures into Greek that was made by the Jews about 200 years before Jesus. And it was the version of the Old Testament that, for the most part, not entirely, but for the most part, that the apostles used in writing the New Testament. Whenever they referred to the scriptures in the New Testament, generally they were either quoting or alluding to the wording in the Septuagint.
Thanks.
So anyway, so when we're talking about the book of Esther, we're talking about the translation into Greek of the book of Esther, and we find that these are the words that we find in the Septuagint, or there's some connection with the Hebrew commentaries on Esther that were about the time of Jesus and Mark, and so on and so forth. So these guests at Herod's banquet seem to be guests who have come from the book of Esther, and Mark is composing a story which is he wants you to think of the book of Esther. He also wants you to think of Judas and other books in the Old Testament as you read John. Now, moving on to the party itself, banquets like Herod's were strictly men's affairs, and so they could get quite bawdy, as you can imagine, with everybody drinking heavily. Sometimes women provided entertainment, but those women would not have been respected family members. So that Herod would allow his daughter to dance for such a crowd. This marks Herod as utterly shameless, and then.
Sorry to interrupt you there, John. There's some controversy or uncertainty, isn't there, about the precise familial connection between this girl and Herod himself. And some translations, like the NIV, which Lucy read from, suggest that it's Herodias' daughter, but not Herod's. But others suggest the opposite.
Yeah, because the other gospels make her the daughter of Herodias, but in the best manuscripts of Mark, it's Herod's daughter. The daughter is Herod's daughter, and not only that, but she is named Herodias also.
Right.
The idea that her name is Salome that comes not accurately, but we get it from Josephus. Actually, it's not mentioned by any of the Gospels. But okay, so that Herod, even if it's Herodias's daughter, it's his stepdaughter.
Yeah.
But in Mark, it's Herod's own daughter, and that Herod's letting her dance in such a situation. It's just shameful. Wouldn't do that. And then Herod is bewitched by her beauty and sensuality, and for a man to be bewitched by a woman in public, again, that's shameful. So Herod comes off as an extremely weak, sort of out of control lecher, and this is just not a good comparison, and it's particularly not a good comparison when King Herod is compared to King Ahasuerus in Esther. And by the way, Mark kind of emphasizes, King Herod. The book of Esther uses the word king far more than any other book in the Old Testament. If memory serves, it uses it more than the entire Old Testament put together. So Mark is really wanting you to think of King Ahasuerus in Esther, who's like a strong, powerful figure. Okay, so here's this picture of Herod that we have. And this is leading off this section of Mark's gospel, which begins with basically with the sending of the 12. It ends with the scene in the boat at the end where Jesus says, keep away from the leaven of Herod and the leaven of the Pharisees. So what we're seeing right now is the leaven of Herod. In the middle, in the dead center of this section, we're going to see the leaven of the Pharisees. And that's the controversy with the Pharisees about eating with unwashed hands. But at the end of that controversy, Jesus says privately to his disciples, what comes out of a person, that defiles a person. Because from inside, from out of the heart of man come evil thoughts, prostitutions, thefts, murders, adulteries, greedinesses, maliciousnesses, deceit, licentiousness, envy, slander, or blasphemy, arrogance, and foolishness. Now, in America, we have this game. You can buy, when you buy a cereal box, a lot of times there's sort of a very busy picture on the back, and you're supposed to find Waldo in the picture, right? Yep. Can you find Waldo in this picture? Can you find Herod in this picture that Jesus has just painted?
Yeah.
That's exactly it. Okay. So Matthew tells us that Herod himself wanted John dead, but he couldn't kill him because he feared the people. In doing so, he pretty much agrees with Josephus' account. In Luke, it's Herodias who wants John dead, and Herod is protecting him. Mark has this, I'm sorry, not in Luke, in Mark, Herod is protecting him. And Mark has this elaborate discussion of how Herodias hated John, wanted him eliminated, was prevented by Herod's admiration for a holy man, but finally found an opportunity in his birthday, and at last succeeded, and in cahoots with Herod's daughter, had him beheaded. So what is this about? Why is Mark kind of messing with the history here? Well, Mark has associated John with Elijah. He wears camel hair garment, leather belt, the whole story, right? Then later on in chapter 9, when they're coming down from the mountain of the Transfiguration, Jesus will confirm that Elijah has come, and they've done whatever they wanted to him, as it was written of him. So if John is Elijah, then Herodias is Jezebel, the wicked queen who killed the prophets of the Lord and sought to kill Elijah. And Herod then would be Ahab, a weak and unfaithful king who did have some positive relationship to Elijah. Jezebel failed to eliminate Elijah, but Herodias eliminates John.
So just to clarify, John, you're saying that Herod is a kind of representation of two kings, the king in the book of Esther and King Ahab with his wife Jezebel at the same time.
The story of Mark's story of the beheading of John the Baptist draws from Judith, from Esther, from First Kings, all over the place. There's a lot going on here, and I think we're supposed to spend a long time kind of really reflecting on it against these different Old Testament stories that it can be compared with, and just sort of hold that up and hold that diamond and look at the different facets. Okay, well, so Jezebel failed to eliminate Elijah. Herodias eliminated John. Okay, now who's Herodias? Well, Herodias had been the wife of Herod's half brother, not his brother Philip, as Mark says. Philip was the tetrarch of northern Transjordan, after whom Caesarea Philippi was named. But Herodias had been the wife of Herod's half-brother, Herod Voithos, who received no part in the inheritance of Herod the Great. Philip was not married to Herodias, but was married to her daughter, Salome. That's where the word Salome comes from. It seems his family, they had a shortage of first names. They called everybody Herod. Herod, by the way, means sparrow, if you're interested in that. Anyway, so they had some predilection for this name, Sparrow, Herod. Well, the whole Herod family was quite reprehensible in many ways, and there were a lot of them. And Mark doesn't want to spend his whole codex talking about the sins of the Herod family. So he tightens up the episode by collapsing all of them kind of into three characters. Wow. And he rolls all their creepiness and violence and avarice and obscenity and nastiness into them, and then he's done with his story. Mark also makes a kind of a big deal of Herod's daughter's dance and Herod's response. Matthew, by comparison, merely says that the daughter of Herodias danced before the company and pleased Herod so that he promised on oath to give her whatever she might ask. That's Matthew. Gives this long scene in which he not only means the dance, but tells that it is Herod and those who are sitting with him. And he adds live dialogue. Ask me whatever you want and I'll give it to you. And Herod even pleads, whatever you ask me, I'll give you up to half my kingdom. So Mark typically is a lot more colorful than Matthew. Or to put it the other way, Matthew removes the color from Mark and just summarizes. But anyway, Herod was a puppet. He was a tetrarch. He was under Rome's domination, and he couldn't make a move without Rome's approval. He wasn't in any position to offer someone, even in a small village, let alone half his kingdom. So what's up with this? Why is Mark putting this sort of improbable thing?
He hasn't got a kingdom either, has he? Potentially, because he's not a king.
Yeah, tetrarchy, right. But in Esther, the Persian king Ahasuerus offers his wife Esther half his kingdom, and does it 3 times. If only she will tell him what's bugging her, what she wants of him. He's ready to do it for her. So he's ready to do it for her. What Herod wants, he wants to get something from her. So she declines the offer of half a kingdom, but invites the king and Haman, his evil counselor, to a banquet. And uses the opportunity to expose Haman's evil intentions and to save the Jewish people from certain death. Herod, Mark's Jewish king, right, who ought to be better than a Persian one, because after all, the Persian was a pagan, right? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Offers half his kingdom to his own daughter to get a night of lust from her, and ends up putting not an enemy, but a holy prophet to death. You see. So a woman could receive half of what a man might receive, but no more. So for a trifling pleasure, which he could have forced on her anyway. Herod was offering the maximum he could possibly give. And he did so on oath in front of his guests. And he was honor bound, after having done such a thing, to keep his word. And if he failed to do so, they wouldn't trust him anymore. So add foolish oaths, drunkenness, and honor to the mix of passions mentioned above that Jesus talked about, the things that come out of the heart of a man. And, well, Herod is this pretty awful character.
I mean, the idea of oaths were taken really seriously in those days. It wasn't just a throwaway. If you made an oath, it was really important that you
your word has to be reliable.
Yeah.
Okay. Mark calls the young girl a Coration. That is, a girl of about the same age as Jairus's daughter, a
12.
Coration. Manuscript variations, as we mentioned, make it uncertain whether the evangelist regarded her as the daughter of Herodias or of Herod himself. But either way, given the nature of Herod's attraction, he's offering her half of his kingdom in exchange for incest. Jairus's Coration was restored to life. Herod's Coration makes a game of murder. Adding to her mother's depravity, she demands eagerly that John's head be brought forthwith on a platter. This is not a ruling class you would want to rule your country.
Can I just check something? If Coration means the same age as the daughter of Jairus, then this girl, whoever she is 12 years old.
Mm-hmm.
But that's enough for him to have incest with her, potentially.
Yeah.
Quite.
Well, we know that, child brides has been a problem throughout history. So, in terms of age, it's maybe not that unusual. But the fact is, she's his daughter or his stepdaughter. This is not something that should be happening.
Sure.
So, adding to her mother's depravity, this Coration demands eagerly that John's head be brought forthwith on a platter. John's very dramatic. But this isn't a ruling class you would want to have ruling over your country. In exchange for her body, the daughter receives the head of a prophet, receives it on a platter, and brings it to her mother. Now, Judas, another great Jewish heroine, whose book is in the Septuagint, not in the Hebrew Bible. And if you haven't read it, you should. It's a really good story in many ways. Judith, after spending nights in chastity and prayer, beheads an evil, herself beheads an evil foreign general, puts his head in a bag, and brings it to her thus liberated people. To John the Baptist, Herod's marriage was not authorized. It's not lawful in most translations. John is referring to Leviticus chapters 18 and 20. And because of this, to Herod, John is a troublemaker, but a just and holy man, whom Mark identifies with a long line of prophets who opposed and rebuked kings for immorality and idolatry. And he's also a member of a long line of martyrs who upheld God's law in the face of royal opposition. Now, Mark tells us that John died because of Herodias' plotting. But Josephus tells us that Herod had John put to death because he threatened the stability of Herod's own regime. Now, we're inclined, as I've said before, to believe Josephus because Josephus isn't writing theology. But there's an interesting thing here. If Herodias had anything to do with John's execution, it might well have been John's charge that it's not lawful for you to have this woman as your wife. In referring to Leviticus, and if a man shall take his brother's wife, it is an uncleanness. He has uncovered his brother's nakedness. They shall be childless. John's demand for Herod's repentance could have been causing the masses to grumble at Herod's covenant unfaithfulness. And this would have been threatening. And moreover, Herodias had divorced her husband Voithos, Herod Voithos, not the other way around. This would explain Jesus' statement in chapter 10:12, which is not found in the other Gospels, that if a woman divorces her husband and marries another, it is adultery. That would be a comment on Herod. So, all in all, summing up the whole thing, Mark's purpose is not to report history, but to paint an icon of John the Baptist against an unforgettable backdrop of imperial colonial corruption, with an emphasis on the kinds of passions that drive people precisely to murder prophets and holy men, and to murder people like Jesus and his disciples. Mark embeds this story precisely in the middle of his account of the sending and return of the 12. And the 12 arguably, as I mentioned, fail because they are prey to just these kinds of passions. And we'll see that over and over again in the next section. Jesus is sending the 12 out to confront unclean spirits with his authority. Sandwich like the story of their sending and return includes the story of empire. Mark is showing what kind of unclean spirits Jesus is confronting and that the 12 will have to confront, and what kinds of passions lead to the murder of a prophet like John. What kinds of passions in themselves are the leaven of Herod. Esther used cunning to secure the death of a powerful enemy and to save Israel. The prophetess Yael in Judges 4 and 5 used cunning to drive a tent peg through the skull of a foreign general and to save Israel. Judith used cunning to behead Holofernes, an Assyrian general, and to save Israel. Herodias uses cunning to secure the death of a prophet, and to oppose God's kingdom, his reign. Mark is weaving a story from scriptural and historical elements to show the nature of empire itself and the way it works. And so at the end of the section, Jesus will say, keep away from the leaven of Herod. And here at the beginning of the section, Mark has shown us what that leaven is. Jesus will also prescribe at the end of the section, keep away from the leaven of the Pharisees, and that will be the subject of the middle of the section, the climax of the section, and the climax of the chiasm of 3 episodes among Israel and 3 episodes among the Gentiles, which then leads to the declaration of his messiahship. John's disciples claim John's headless corpse and take it and lay it in a tomb. When it comes time for Jesus to be buried, his disciples will be nowhere to be found.
Thank you very much.
Very interesting. Very interesting. Thank you, John. Steph, have you got any comments on that? Any questions? 100 questions, probably.
I've got quite a lot. It would be great to ask John a few of them. I think personally what you've done is not only give a completely compelling and convincing account of this passage, but you've linked it with other passages in the gospel itself, let alone all the references you've made to the Old Testament, which have often bemused people. You know, that comment of Jesus is, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and that of Herod. It's one of those things that stick out like a sore thumb when people read the gospel. And often, I confess, in the past, I read such passages and thought to myself, I don't understand it. Let's just move on to the bits I do understand. But we can't really leave it at that. And what you're doing in talking just about this episode is enabling us to see how rich a tapestry, as you put it, it's a weaving, the gospel is. I know, though, John, that for many who are listening to this, what you've just said is very controversial. And there'll be people, really. And there'll be people who'll be saying, hold on a second, are you telling me that Mark wasn't reporting historical data? And it will come as a bit of a shock. And yet what you've said clearly has to have an explanation. And unless you say, and I'm not sure many people would, Josephus made a mistake and his account was wrong, and Mark was listening to another story, well, I don't think that really holds much water personally, but that may be a view that some people might throw back at you.
Well, the problem that you would have with that is that the gospel accounts of Matthew, Mark, and Luke themselves differ from each other.
Yeah.
And as I say, for example, Herod was not a king. He simply wasn't. It wasn't his title, and you can't call him that. But as I said, what Mark is doing, he's not interested in historical reportage, reportage. What he's interested in is very much like painting an icon. He's sort of highlighting certain aspects. He's bringing out the drama of it and all of that, because what he wants to get at is the inner life of these characters. And I think he does kind of a really quite brilliant job of portraying Herod as this really weak, sort of disgusting person against the backdrop of a number of important Old Testament passages. And as I've said to you before, the New Testament is really about the Old Testament.
Yeah.
It's and so that's what he's doing. He's showing, well, this is where all of that, where Holofernes and Haman and all of his other bad guys in the Old Testament, this is where they're coming from. This is the leaven of Herod. This is the leaven of empire.
Yeah. And he's contrasting that leaven of empire in itself with the empire of God, the reign or the realm of God, which is of a completely different order. So
we would want to contrast chapter 6 with chapter 15 and really kind of go through that.
That's interesting. So in that case, what we have here, as we've talked about before, I know, is this sense of an eschatological conflict going on between the empire of this world against the empire of God. And Jesus represents something completely different to what is commonly the case. The empire that you've described here in Herod's court is not a million miles away from some of the manifestations of empire which we see today in many areas of world politics and culture. What I'm interested in what you said was how you linked the driving out of demons by the apostles previous to this story with this story, in the sense that you said something along the lines of this way of living which is described in the story of Herod is exactly the sort of thing that demons represent. It's the opposite of God's kingdom. Would that be correct to think about it in that way?
Yeah, I mean, all those things that Jesus mentioned, what comes out of a person, that defiles a person. Because from inside, from out of the heart of men, come evil thoughts, prostitutions, thefts, murders, adulteries, greedinesses, maliciousnesses, deceit, licentiousness, envy, slander, blasphemy, arrogance, foolishness. All these things come from within. These are spiritual realities that the disciples are going to have to confront, and they're going to have to confront them in themselves.
Yes.
Before they can really confront them in others.
David, what do you think? Any thoughts?
Yeah, well, that was absolutely fascinating, John. Thank you. I was wondering, you said that you talked about allusions to Esther in particular and the number of references to kings and all that. With the original, I mean, that you need to have a degree and to have studied Mark for years to come up with that. With the, I hadn't heard, nobody on Facebook mentioned it, or that they'd heard it anywhere. Would the original listeners have been much more aware of those points, or would they have been pointed out, highlighting the word king, or I don't know how it would have been presented?
I wonder how they could have missed it. Remember that the book of Esther is the festal scroll that's read on the Feast of Purim. And so, and it's read, every time the reader reads the name Haman in Esther, everybody is sort of supposed to make noise and boo and hiss, and so forth. So it's a very sort of lively part of Jewish culture. And so people will be very familiar with the book of Esther and also with the book of Judith, I think.
Yeah.
So,
we're talking about people who are biblically very literate, aren't they? Mm-hmm. Many of the listeners to old Mark's story.
Yeah, and this is heard every year in the synagogue.
Yes.
So
I think most of the questions, particularly about this story being sandwiched between Jesus's life and the things that his teaching the disciples and so on, you've made total sense of that and you've answered them. I think what I'd like to ask, unless Stefan's got a number of other questions, maybe for another day, is what would you want us now and our listeners to take away from this story, or what could we take away from this story, or is that up to us?
Well, I do think that there are important, serious connections between this picture of Herod, that this icon of Herod and John the Baptist, which Mark has painted. And icons are stylized, that's the whole point. But there are serious, deep connections between the picture that he's painted here of Herod and John, and that and chapter 7, verses 22 and 23, that list of passions that Jesus names. And really, what Mark is doing, if we're going to take something home with us from this, is inviting us to look at ourselves and to search out, whatever the ways are that we participate in these evil passions that defile us. Yeah. And that we'll see in the next section, which starts in chapter 8.22 and runs to the end of chapter 10, which we'll see over and over again the disciples themselves are instances of their jockeying for power. They're arguing about who's the greatest. Yes. They want to sit at the right hand and the left, and all of this stuff. This is Herod stuff.
I think you've given us enough to think about for quite a time, and I think we're going to have to wrap up the conversation now, if that's all right. John Burnett and Stefan Smart, it's been such a pleasure, and hopefully it will have sparked conversations among our listeners. Thank you so much for joining us today. Please join us again or listen to previous episodes on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Music platforms. And if you have thoughts, dear listener, about what we've discussed, why not get involved with the I Am Mark Community Facebook group? This is where you can not only access all of the episodes, but we'll also have access to all things I Am Mark, and even to Stefan himself and some guests on previous episodes, maybe even John. If you're not already a member, you can easily join. Just find it on Facebook and ask to join the conversation. John Burnett and Stefan Smart, thank you very much indeed for joining us today. And until next time, goodbye.
If you enjoyed this episode of Question Mark and don't want to miss any future episodes, be sure to click on the subscribe button. This also means other people can find the podcast and join the conversation too. We'd also love if you could leave a review so we know what was good and what we can improve for future episodes. If you want to find out more about I Am Mark, Stefan Smart's solo word-for-word dramatisation of Mark's Gospel, go to www.sleek.bio/IamMark, where you can sign up for free for his newsletter and a whole host of other goodies. Join us and our special guests next time, where we'll continue to explore the greatest story ever told together. If you want to get involved with the podcast or have any questions or comments in the meantime, please do get in touch using the I Am Mark social media channels. We'd love to hear from you.
We light it up, we won't come down, and the sun can't stop us now. Watching it come true, it's taking over you. This is the greatest show, where it's covered in all the colored lights, and the runaways are on in the night. Impossible comes true, it's taking over you. This is the greatest show.